Hello and welcome to another update. In this one I'll be covering the latest developments from the front line and give a general recap after the update of the developments throughout July. Starting out with the Zaporizhzhia front, heavy fighting continues all throughout the Zaporizhzhia front all the way to Velika Novosylka and the Verenevsky Ledge area. So starting out here in the south, the fighting continues and the Russian forces continues to attempt to recapture the lost fortifications here to the east of Robotyne. And the Ukrainian forces are not launching any armored convoys in this direction. They're trying to consolidate the areas that they have taken, and they try to prevent the Russians from recapturing these positions, which is why it's required for them to consolidate their gains and after that launch their next convoy. Until then, we see fighting continuing in all other areas, specifically in the Verenevsky Ledge area by Staromaiorske. So according to the latest update by Syriac maps, the area to the south of Staromaiorske, the Russian forces have not re-entered the village. They are staying by the heights to the south and to the west of the village, and they are constantly shelling the Ukrainian positions within it. And the Ukrainian forces here are not retreating from it. They're trying to hold onto it and respond with their own artillery. From the area here, we see multiple videos of the fighting that goes on by the Staromaiorske area, of which there is this area video here where there is a bunch of infantry that moves along by one of the river lines here in the north of Staromaiorske, and they were detected by Russian artillery. Then we have another video here showcasing from the perspective of a Leopard tank, and it was attacking Russian positions from a far distance, and it was hit by an RPG on the side. It's not known whether the RPG actually had an effect on disabling the vehicle or not, but it was definitely hit in the video. And then we have this final video of fighting by Verenevsky Ledge in the village of Staromaiorske itself. And in this video, we actually see a lot of artillery hits on the positions of the Ukrainian forces inside and at the borders of the village as the Russian forces try to get rid of the Ukrainians within the village. And that's where we get to this article here by VOA, Voice of America. And they write here that according to a Ukrainian soldier who's 29 years old in the 35th Marine Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, he claims the Russians were waiting for them. They ended up being ambushed in the village of Staromaiorske after they captured it. It was silent for a while, and then suddenly they were hit by anti-tank weapons, grenade launchers, artillery, anti-tank mines, all of these things at the same time suddenly, and they were essentially caught off guard. Throughout their operation, they were hit by one after another bump on the road, quite literally, as he claims they methodically destroyed the roads. They made pits that prevented driving in and out of the village, even in dry weather. Even walking was quite hard. You can't use flashlights at night, but you still have to advance. Essentially, they can't see anything. They have to drive through this terrible road, and they constantly are under fire. And then he ends off with, "Many of us who went will never return home." Then we move on to the next part of the front line, which is by Avdiivka, and here there's also reported to be heavy fighting as the Russian forces continue to push northwestwards from the Vodiane area to the west of Avdiivka. There's also a lot of back and forth to the north of Avdiivka by the Krasnoarivka and Kamyanka areas, but there's been no territorial changes in the area. Then we move on to the flanks of Bakhmut, where here both sides are fighting heavily. The Ukrainian forces continue their attempts at taking control of Klishchiivka and pushing towards Avdiivka and Kurdyomivka. However, according to the latest reports, there has been no changes since the Russian forces managed to fully recapture the village of Klishchiivka 4 days ago, and since then there's been no changes on the front line, but there's a lot of heavy fighting in the area. The Ukrainians continue to send reinforcements to the area, and so are the Russians, so there's getting a larger and larger troop buildup in the area, but that's about it. There's a lot of artillery fighting on each side on the other, and there's not any territorial changes. As for the northern flank, the same here, with both sides gathering more troops. and the Ukrainians continuously attempting to advance in these areas. In the Avdiivka area, the Ukrainians have not advanced since the 22nd of July, which is now over a week ago. And as for the Rostolivka area, there's been no changes since the 10th of July. So generally, the flanks are mostly not moving right now, as we have reached the area where Klishchiivka, the Russians are holding onto it at all costs. As I've been mentioning many times, the Russians will not let Klishchiivka fall to the Ukrainians, as that would mean the end of the southern flank of Bakhmut. And then we move on to the northern parts, where fighting also continues by the Kreminna area, both in the Staromaiorske forest areas, but also to the west by Torske and to the northwest by Zaporizhzhia, as they try to advance in these parts and get rid of the Ukrainian positions in the area. Fighting also continues here, and it has been confirmed by Syriac map that the area here has been recaptured by the Ukrainian forces. So they've managed to recapture fully the village of Avdiivka, and they've also managed to push the Russian forces back in the Nadia area, but they're still fighting over the village. So the Russians still have this bridgehead across the river line, but it is much smaller now in comparison to what they had, and the Ukrainian forces are continuously pushing them back. As for the northern parts, the Russian forces continue their attempts at fighting towards Klishchiivka, and they try to push in the direction of the village as they try to gain full control over the forest patch area here to the north of Kupyansk. Generally, it seems that Russian strategy right now is to continuously build up their forces and try to grind down the Ukrainian forces before they launch their own attack. We've seen them gain a bridgehead across the river line, which would have been an obvious step for them to then take an offensive in this direction. However, they did not launch any. Their forces that crossed the river line were mainly Stormzy units, where they essentially only had infantry crossing and with artillery support, and that's how they captured these villages. But they never sent extra reinforcements across, they never sent their tanks, armored vehicles, and so on, which is why we're seeing the Ukrainians now pushing them back, because the Russians simply did not have enough forces across the river line to actually hold these positions. So they are mainly using artillery to defend, combined with the infantry that they have sent across. That leads me to believe the Russians currently have a huge amount of forces in the Luhansk area. They also have a lot of forces generally spread out across the front line. They also have forces in reserve. They have Wagner with about 50,000, 60,000 troops in the Belarus area, or generally spread out throughout areas within Russia. Where they exactly are, there's no confirmed information. There's only a limited amount that has gone to Belarus to train the Belarusian army. The rest are essentially missing, and Prigozhin himself has been traveling between St. Petersburg and Belarus. The headquarters of Wagner is located in St. Petersburg, which indicates that the quote-unquote exile is non-existent, considering he has been going back and forth. I think it is recorded to be over 7 times since the 24th of June. So this is a very common thing he's doing, and that means that there's nothing holding him back, so he's not really in exile. So we are very soon to see Wagner returning to the front line based on information I've gained from Remy, but also on the fact that the Russians are continuously paying for Wagner, and they wouldn't be paying for it if they were gaining nothing in return. This means that generally Wagner has some plans for them returning to the front line, and it is most likely going to be soon. As I've mentioned, the Russians are paying for them, and there doesn't seem to be any exile ongoing, so most likely it was just to divert the attention, possibly to make Ukraine or the West in general believe that the Wagner will be attacking from the northern area, but in reality they may be attacking anywhere on the front line, as there's been no confirmed information as to where they are. As for the recap of what has happened throughout the month of July, I have mapped out all of the territorial changes. By the western parts, the Ukrainian forces have managed to fully capture Pyatkhy, the forest line to the west of it, and moved further northwest in an attempt of capturing fully the village of Kamyansk. And we see them advancing westwards, but they've not managed to capture any of the areas with fortifications. The Russians have some fortifications by the Dacha area, as well as here to the north of Luhove. Generally, the fields here to the west of Serebianki are filled with trenches. So until then, the Ukrainians are advancing throughout the northern parts to gain a wider front in this area. As for the central part by the south of Novodanilivka, the Ukrainian forces managed to advance further and actually reach the first line of defense of the Russian forces. But since then, the Russians have counterattacked and kicked them out of the area. And they've also managed to hold on to Robotyne throughout the whole month. As for the Staromaiorske area, we see that the Ukrainian forces managed to capture the village, but have since been pushed out of the most of the village. The rest is in the gray zone, and there's a part where they still hold a foothold. The Ukrainians have also reached the village of Priotne, but that is generally the changes throughout the month of July. They have managed to capture half a village in the whole month in this part of the front line. So in the whole Zaporizhzhia front, from Kupyansk to Staromaiorske, the Ukrainians have managed to capture half a village, which was Pyatatki. They already had a foothold within it. They have managed to capture the rest of it. That's half a village, and they hold half of Staromaiorske. So in combined, they have captured one village on the Kamyansk to Velikonovosilka area. As for the Bakhmut area, they have captured 0 villages. They captured fields to the southwest of Klishchiivka, west of Avdiivka, northwest of Kreminna, and south of Avdiivka, north of Soledar. They have captured a lot of fields, but there's no villages captured in this part. As for this area here, the Russian forces managed to capture a village and a half, and the Ukrainians managed to recapture 2 villages. Half the village of Nadia and the whole village of Novodiorivka, half of this village here. And generally, what we're seeing is that neither side is actually capturing anything of significance. There's a lot of back and forth and heavy fighting throughout the whole front. But generally, nothing is happening in terms of the map changing. All that's happening is a lot of grinding down, and the battle of attrition is just picking up speed. And that is essentially the conclusion so far of the Ukrainian offensive. It's one large battle of attrition with little to no movement. And that is going to be all for this update. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and check out my Patreon or PayPal if you want to support me further. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.